Welcome to the American Reformer Podcast, hosted by Josh Abatoy and Timon Klein. Our mission is to promote a vigorous Christian approach to the cultural challenges of our day, rooted in the rich tradition of Protestant social and political thought.
All right, welcome back, everybody, to the American Reformer Podcast. Usual co-hosts here, Josh Abatoy, Executive Director, is with me, and I'm Timon Klein, Editor-in-Chief. And we're joined today by our special guest and friend, Auron MacIntyre, who has a book coming out that many of you have probably heard of and are looking forward to, called Total State: How Liberal Democracies Turn into... I already messed it up, Auron. I'm sorry. Turn into Tyranny?
Yes.
Okay. And it's out May 7th, so everyone should be looking for that and get their pre-orders in. But if you're not convinced to do so, maybe you will be after you've heard us talk about it a little bit. Many of you are probably familiar with Auron because of his work at The Blaze, his regular columns there, and most likely his podcast, which, Auron, how long have you been doing your own podcast? It seems like for a while, but I'm not sure exactly.
I started doing the YouTube before I was even on Twitter. That I got onto Twitter to tell people about my YouTube channel, and I was doing, I guess, what you could call a podcast there, but I didn't actually launch like the podcast onto things like Apple or anything until I joined The Blaze. So a little over a year.
Gotcha. And many of you may have seen Auron also doing back to your, would that be Iowa, when you were doing some of the election analysis?
Yeah. When we were at when they had the town hall where Tucker was interviewing every candidate.
An amazing event. I thoroughly enjoyed it. But Auron, thanks for coming on, and maybe just give everybody a little bit of background too of how you got to where you are, for those of you that are unfamiliar.
Sure. I started out as a journalist. Well, I studied politics in college. I ended up teaching for a little while, and then I kind of fell backwards into kind of just local journalism. I was writing for a paper doing politics and crime for a couple different local publications, and I kind of noticed that things weren't working the way I had learned about them. You know, when I'd done a little work in Republican politics, it just the seeing behind the curtain of the media machine kind of told me that there was something going on that I didn't understand. And then 2020 election happened and nothing worked. The Constitution didn't seem to work. The lockdowns, the craziness, the riots, and that kind of sent me on a journey of trying to figure out, okay, if politics doesn't work the way that I had learned about it, how does it actually work? And that's when I started reading a lot of people who were outside the mainstream, older political theorists that I had never heard of before, and I started talking about it on YouTube and talking about it on Twitter, and that's how I ended up doing what I'm doing now.
Excellent. Yeah, I always recommend your podcast to people that when they ask me, how do I get into sort of, I hear people talking about different authors and different concepts, but you obviously don't read this stuff in school, as you said. We could call it sort of dissident literature, but most of it's actually older, right? It's not new or been produced over the past few years. And I usually direct them to your podcast because you've had several series on covering different thinkers, whether it's Schmidt or Dugan or these kinds of authors. So it's very much of your podcast is educational, not just touching on current events, although you do that as well. But we want to talk about the book. So tell us a little bit about why you wrote this book and basically what it's about.
Yeah, like I said, really the book is just kind of the pulling together of all the things I've learned in the last few years as I've gone on this journey. It's really about kind of my intellectual crisis. I'm a basic talk radio conservative, neocon leanings, the kind of guy who just absorbed all of the things you would get from Fox News and the normal talking heads. And I had that kind of bog standard worldview for a long time. And so when I started watching the fact that the Constitution actually didn't stop any kind of government overreach, that actually the government would just shut down churches and they would just lock people in their homes and no one would do anything. And nothing, all these protections that I had learned about that were built into the Bill of Rights, all these checks and balances, all these stopgaps against tyranny, they really meant nothing. And I was just kind of blown away. My entire foundation about what America was and how we were protected and all of these things was just completely shattered. And so the book kind of it walks through that journey and all of these different thinkers that I engaged with and how they explain that the different things that we believe about democracy and its ability to limit the government aren't actually the case. That actually democracy is a proven way to expand the authority of the government, to expand its reach, to expand its mandate. That an increasement of the franchise is actually just always correlated with a larger and more powerful government. Many of the checks and balances, the different constitutional safeguards that were supposed to be built in, this complicated Rube Goldberg machine that was supposed to just give us a neutral government that was only there to protect our natural rights as enumerated in the Constitution, why that architecture didn't work, and why ultimately the politics that we're seeing today is not very new, but it's actually very old. It's a reemergence of what we would expect if we were actually familiar with history, if we were familiar with the nature of mankind, if we were familiar with a lot of this stuff. And what we're really seeing is that society doesn't scale, that the things that we have done to kind of remove the barriers to the free flows of things like capital and labor and the normalization and homogenation of cultures and peoples, all of that stuff actually breaks down the things that actually control government, that actually give us liberty, that actually protect us from overreach. And all of the things that we were told that we're going to mechanically do that, they don't do that unless the people are invested in a very particular way of life. And so the Total State is really a book following the why these things didn't protect us and the development of our current ruling class. Many people will call them the managerial elite, and why they have come to dominate us in this time of kind of the mass man, the mass society.
Right. So on your, in your understanding, is, people may wonder, are you arguing that these issues, the crises that we're now facing, are sort of endemic to the structure of our constitutional order? As some in a grad seminar, we may sit around and talk about how it's supposed to be and what it's supposed to do. That it was always the case, or that it's the particular personnel that now occupy it and have occupied it for some time, have used it as a vehicle to create something that wasn't intended, obviously, and that didn't necessarily have to happen, and they're the ones that have used it to erode the homogeneity and the sort of prerequisites for good governance.
I'm actually arguing a third option, which is that the problem we're facing is not that we were hijacked by a kind of a rogue elite that is not interested in our well-being, though that is true, and not that the Constitution in and of itself was going to create the society we have now, though there are certain parts of it that we could probably say have some liability to that. But actually, the argument I'm making is that scale is the enemy of civilization,
Mm-hmm.
and that ultimately we cannot expand the culture of a people, the tradition of the people, infinitely without losing the
Mm-hmm.
nature of the people. And so we hear this idea of exporting democracy. Everyone was familiar with this kind of language from the global war on terror. The idea that that George Bush would go out there and he would just make sure that everybody in the Middle East had a liberal democracy, and that the entire world was going to change in this way. And we find that actually that's just a stand-in for, we want to install our managerial bureaucracy. We want to expand our empire across all of these different nations. And some of them will simply reject it because not all of these countries can or want to or should be governed in this way. In fact, this way of being is particular to a type of people and a tradition and a culture which values it. And so we could have perhaps a constitutional republic as long as we are keeping it, isolated to the United States. And but if we continue to scale these things, if we continue to bring them out to peoples and places that were uninterested in them, we're naturally going to invite the expansion of a managerial elite that create a global spanning empire that is basically sucking the United States dry and turning it into a tyranny. And I think it's pretty obvious to people at this point that that is actually the process we're undergoing.
Yeah, I was on a
there's
go
a
ahead, Josh.
two-way street that happens in this process, right? Because the government is becoming sort of more ambivalent about its sort of national interests as it transforms into an imperial government. It's the interests that it's seeking to maximize are no longer sort of the interests of the American people, but they're the interests of some larger, set of imperial participants. And on the flip side, the citizen is less loyal to the government, right? The citizen goes from viewing the government as a legitimate representative government of the American people to viewing it as a sort of a commercial exchange partner. You remain in that imperial bargain so long as it remains sort of convenient. So this essentially significantly reduces the reciprocal loyalty that would typically flow both directions in sort of a healthy, smaller nation state.
Yeah, and I was on I was talking with our friend Ben Crenshaw yesterday about this, actually, on a different podcast, and we've talked about this before too, Josh, that in this question of scale, the problem of scale was one that was there basically from the beginning. I mean, you can read lots of the founders even, expressing their anxieties over this very issue. And that was back when you had 3 million people, and prior to the Northwest Ordinance and westward expansion. And they're already worried about this because they know that scale will, obviously it's going to invite more people who are not going to immediately be integrated. And then there's going to be a problem of homogeneity and just pure governance in a practical matter as you occupy greater and greater space. And even at the beginning, there's already people referring to the entire project as, a sort of domestic empire, which is I think is an accurate way to describe us now, certainly. But at that time, it was in some ways more positive because the idea was, well, we have essentially 13 nations that are all very agreeable, independent republics, very agreeable but small and at least homogenous on the inside from their perspective. Now that seems to have been, it's kind of funny that through the assertion of extreme unity and nationhood at scale has actually led to the dissolution of any kind of unity. Whereas if you had maintained this idea that you're actually sort of a confederacy, a large empire over several nations, you could have maintained more homogeneity and more unity.
Yeah, I think that's right. Auron, do you think think that the United States sort of, just if you look at it as a continent, is of itself sort of definitionally an empire? Like, do you think that wrapped up in the manifest destiny was an inevitability that we would become an empire rather than a nation that could have a functioning republic? Or do you think it's sort of the overseas adventurism?
I think that the former is correct. I think that you are always, because of this constant drive for expansion, this need to always, rather than to conform and form one nation, but rather instead to move away from each other and expand whenever there's a disagreement, meant that you were always kind of bound to have this imperial mindset. The United States never really properly underwent an ethnogenesis because just the geographic space and the constant desire to expand meant that many of your cultures were able to isolate themselves almost immediately from each other, and people lived very different lives across the United States. They certainly had a shared identity to some extent as Americans, but people in California were living a radically different life from people in North Carolina or Maine, and so these were radically different peoples in many ways, and they never really formed a one united idea of what they would be. They were held together by this general American identity, particularly Protestant Christian kind of ethic that allowed the extreme federalism of the United States to still kind of operate everything under one banner. But you never really had that complete level of unity that I think a lot of people would understand. If the United States obviously was in a place like Europe, it would have been several different nations. It would not have been one unified one. And I think there's also an inevitability to any great power will at some level become an empire. I think empires actually are the natural organizing kind of principle of a
Hmm.
larger world, which is something that's probably difficult for a lot of people who are aiming at kind of nationalism right now to grapple with. But what we're seeing is that the United States, in many ways, became an imperial power because it needed to keep pace. We saw this with many different nations, especially approaching World War One, where they realized, well, we need to go ahead and get colonies. We need to secure. We need to get in on this global imperialism, because if we don't do it, someone else is going to. And this arms race of government centralization and scale, you can't fall behind. That's one of the arguments I make in the book, is that one of the reasons we were driven towards this is that power naturally wants to grow, and it naturally needs to keep at pace with its neighbors, or will be conquered. It will eventually fall to those. If your neighbor gets the levee en masse, if they're able to mass conscript an entire army, and if they get tanks, they get nuclear weapons, you have to do the same. You have to maintain parity, and the
Hmm.
ability to do this on a mass scale requires the ability to basically have a large mandate from your people, which is why liberal democracy became the most common government for people who were wanting to kind of generate this level of control of the populace. Again, I don't think liberal democracy is a freeing of the populace. I think it's a reason for the government to then need to indoctrinate everyone in the populace. And so I think that in order for us to simply compete on the world stage, we were going to have to push this direction. I think, unfortunately, a lot of the founders knew that, and there was a big struggle between more of the Hamiltonian wing and the Jeffersonian wing, whether we should participate in that race. But that race was going to exist whether
Hmm.
we participated in it or not.
Hmm. Well, and you had a good, I think this was recent, or, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, a good conversation with Martyrmade about that was long, so it covered a lot of ground, but it touched on these same themes, and also brought in a lot of considerations about mass immigration, just the way it played out in a very dispassionate way. I think that's why it was helpful. And this was just much of what you're saying is the external pressures of competition require that you grow in this way, but then there were also, it seems to me on your reading, internal pressures that naturally happened that required the same.
Correct. Again, if power wants to centralize, it needs to hollow out the middle. Basically, if your power is naturally regional, it's especially first feudal and then bourgeoisie power. It's distributed regionally. It's people who are reliant on communities for institutions that are isolated in their area to go ahead and maintain their civilizations. But to scale up, you need to adopt a more bureaucratic way of building governments. Gaetano Mosca is a political theorist, and he said basically all states oscillate between this feudal and this bureaucratic setup. And in order to scale to become more complex, eventually you must enter into the bureaucratic setup. And in order to go ahead and scale that power up, for the power to centralize more effectively, they need to go ahead and pull power away from those regional concerns. You can't centralize power if people are still mostly reliant on their communities, because the thing that we have kind of lied to ourselves about is that we could all become individuals who are completely unreliant on others. We don't have to be reliant on our families. We don't have to be reliant on our churches. We don't have to be reliant on our communities or any politicians or anything like that. We can all be this highly functional libertarian individual, the Ayn
Hmm.
Rand character who never has to rely on anyone. But that's not true. In fact, people will always need to rely on something, and if they don't rely on individual families and communities and churches, they will rely on the state. And so the state, in order to accrue power to itself, needs to go ahead and hollow out all those intermediate institutions, all those other social spheres that were taking over power, that were giving people the things that they needed, that were relied upon. And so to do that, you need to go ahead and bring in people who are going to be reliant on you and the government, and not on any of those existing cultural or traditions or institutions. And so that's where things like mass immigration are very useful, because you can bring in a lot of people who don't immediately have jobs and don't immediately have communities and don't immediately have churches or other communal infrastructure that's local to them that they can rely on. And they're immediately entirely reliant on you, and you can promise to go ahead and displace the current population, though you always need to get rid of the kulaks, as the Soviets did, in order to go ahead and centralize power. And so it's a large bit of what the mass immigration thing does. It's the function that it needs to perform for the regime, is to go ahead and hollow out that middle class, transfer their wealth away from these regional institutions and powers, and instead they can go ahead and be distributed to these people who are now complete clients of the centralized state.
Yeah, it's one of the things that one of the many things I find incoherent about libertarians is, they're often Randians, but even if they're not Randians, they're high individualists. But they usually have an emphasis on strong localism and, as small of units as you can have in governance. But it's always the case that it's easier to be an individual in the sense that they think of it, under a centralized power, than it is under a more localized and regional based power, because your participation is not required. In fact, it's not wanted. You just need compliance, or at least some kind of neglect for the things that are going on. But what to your mind? I don't know if you go into this in the book. How is this? How do you enforce this sort of mindset or consciousness? Because most people, when they think of politics, it's entirely federal, it's national. That's all they pay attention to. Even as there still exist many ways regionally and at a state level, for people to do things. There's an immense, I mean, some governors are showing some of this at this point, but people just don't have that kind of gear in their consciousness anymore. There's no attention paid to it, even as their interests reside there.
Well, I think the thing to remember, and this is again another point of the book over and over again, is that the idea of popular sovereignty is a lie. No people can ever be sovereign
Yes.
over themselves. That's not what the word sovereignty means. And so from the very beginning, most people who are actively practicing American politics misunderstand how it actually works. Uh, Organized minorities rule us. That is what all power structures come down to. They are the organized minority who rule over the disorganized majority. And so I don't think the average person is ever going to focus on changing politics. I don't think that's how politics works. I don't think that's how it's ever worked. And I don't think that's how it's going to work now. So the question is not so much when do we get the average conservative or the average GOP voter to realize that they should be focusing on local elections. You don't. I mean, the way that you do this is you get a highly organized group of individuals to take over regional political power. And again, I think we're seeing that in places like Florida. The reason that Florida is able to do many of the things that it's doing is because it has a level of organization, party organization. It has a vigorous executive who is willing to use power and it will not be cowed by media or the challenges that are thrown at him by other forces, and is willing to tell, most importantly, the federal government to go pound sand. And we saw the same thing with Greg Abbott. He's not had quite the same level of statewide power. The way that Ron DeSantis has established it, but his willingness to go ahead and tell the federal government the same thing on the border is critical. And so I think that we need to have governors like this. I think executives state executives are a particularly important part of this formula. The legislatures are important. We need to capture those, but they are not the ones that are probably going to drive the majority of this battle. They will follow a vigorous executive if they're willing to go ahead and operate in this manner. And the way we get those is wins. People want to win. Greg Abbott is doing what he did because he watched Ron DeSantis do what he did. And that's why I think Ron DeSantis is the most important person in the United States, exactly where he is, as my governor in Florida, not as president, not because he probably wouldn't be a good president, but because his ability to show what regional power can do and the way that it can achieve huge things without having to trudge through the swamp in DC that is far more entrenched and far more powerful, I think lays out a blueprint for what red states can actually do when they're organized.
Mm. Yeah, we didn't care for Robot Ron. We like Pork Chop Ron back in Florida. As a resident of Florida, I can say I much prefer that the human Ron to be back, which he is. But speaking of a vigorous executive, one of the conversations on the sort of right that's gone on, which you've been involved in, and there's much confusion over, is this sort of Caesarism idea. We've written some on that. It seems to me it's been an odd conversation in terms of its reception, because it's much less important that it's prescriptive rather than descriptive
Yes.
of what just happens, and sort of these cycles of regimes, which Josh took much flack on, but wrote about, and I think took more flack on it after he wrote about it at First Things. But this sort of cycles of regimes, of this is simply how the reactions play out typically. And there's of course debate over exactly what the transition between one form of government and another would be, or whether these are just sort of always elements that are in balance, sort of ebb and flowing. And is so at least at these more regional, it could end up being regional. Right now, there's signs of life at a state level. Is this the natural sort of cycle of regimes, given the conditions that is playing out, or is this just a case of a couple guys being aggressive, and that will sort of die with them?
I think this is a cycle of regimes. Now, the interesting thing will be, it's not a question of whether or not the United States will need to be guided by a firm hand. It's very clear. I mean, we look at Joe Biden, and there is no more perfect kind of example of what a weak fox-like, tricky oligarchy wants to be as its figurehead. Joe Biden he's barely conscious. He doesn't know where he is. He takes all of the blame for what happens, and you don't know who's actually in charge in the United States. Literally, if you walk up to pretty much anyone in the United States and you ask them who's in charge of the United States right now, they don't know. And that's insane, right? That for a government that prides itself, for a people who pride itself on like the clarity of the Constitution and how obviously it sets up our powers and outlines our freedoms and tells us how to hold leaders accountable. It is literally impossible for us to hold leaders accountable right now. Nobody would know. Like, yeah, you can get rid of Joe Biden, but nobody believes he's really making decisions. No one really believes he's running this country, but no one knows who is. And that's an absolutely insane scenario. And we can see the consequences of that, because there is no accountability, because the mechanisms that are supposed to inform the way that we hold politicians accountable clearly just do not work in the current situation. Everything is coming apart. We're having a competency crisis. We are in an insane amount of debt. We're funding proxy wars across the globe on completely manufactured money. We're endangering every bit of our ability for energy and trade. We're destroying our social fabric. We're leaving our borders open. These are things, if you were to create a cabal of the enemies of the United States and tell them, make up a plan about how you would govern the United States if you wanted to destroy it, it's hard for them to come up with something any worse than what we're living through right now. And so it's very clear that we're not going to fix this problem by just like, I don't know, getting a slightly more based Speaker of the House. Like obviously that's just not the kind of situation we're in. So the question is not, will this figure arise? As you said, I think that's inevitable. That's a cycle of the regime. What's going to break the power of the oligarchy? It is always the Caesar. That is something we see over and over again. But the question is, would this Caesar be national, or will they be regional? Will the United States be able to hold together as an entity? Because we can't assume the empire is eternal. And so would it be that more competent regional leaders, governors and things, kind of more natural partitions, and smaller scales would be those which take over. I think that's a very real question that I think hasn't been answered yet.
Well, I was at an event the other day that where Newt Gingrich was speaking, and I thought it was going a really good direction because he started talking about how, it's just raw power. You have to think in terms of power and a zero-sum game. If they win, we lose, vice versa. I was like, okay. And then he was like, so you need to go out and vote. I was just like, wow, that was incredibly depressing to just, turn on a dime from what had so much potential to, go apply the Band-Aid solution. Let's get a better speaker in. Let's, we really need to hit the polls, guys.
Primary some of
That's what
these
it's going to
guys,
take.
toss out those
Yeah,
rhinos. Yeah.
right, exactly. And all the while, and no surprise that it was said that we must defeat Putin to avoid World War III, and that's our top priority right now. So it's just this cognitive dissonance out of most of the right. Obviously, Newt represents much of the old guard, even if he was subversive for his day, is extremely depressing and should cause people to rightly lose confidence in the national leadership. And I think, look for opportunities to gain the upper hand elsewhere. But do you think on the right, apart from, frog Twitter or whatever that has their eyes open, is there energy to do that or motivation to do that?
I think motivation is coming. The thing, I have been in very different spheres in the last year of my life than I've ever been in before, and so it's been very, very interesting. But I think that for a very long time, people were asleep at the wheel. I think that with Trump, a lot of people didn't understand what was happening. They knew something was wrong, and they knew that people were electing a guy like Trump for a reason, but they didn't get why it is. And you can still tell because there's still a lot of these people who are still never Trump, even though they kind of pretended not to be for a while. And this is not about Trump, to be clear. Like, I have no loyalty to Trump, in the sense that like he's a great president or he is completely unworthy of the movement he has. To be really clear, but that doesn't matter because people are so desperate for the kind of thing that Trump represented that even if he was a weak facsimile of it, they would take it, and they would lay down in traffic for it at this point. And so I think that what people are starting to understand is that on the very edges of the mainstream is what time it is. That people who have mainstream platforms, mainstream outlets, who have a lot to lose, are going out and saying things that they would not have said just a few years ago. Things that would have gotten them canceled, things that would have gotten them fired, things that would have gotten them destroyed in public. And I think that's a good shift. That means people are understanding that the hour is late and you don't have really time to sit around the edge of this stuff and pretend like it's not happening. At the same time, I still think there's a lot of cope, and there's a lot of just I don't want to rock this boat. We've been talking about the Democrats are they're communists, and we've been talking about that kind of stuff for a very long time, and there's no need to shift any of that. Russia's our eternal enemy. These things are things that are just going to continuously kind of put our older audience to sleep and make us money, and so we're not going to cross that line. I think that there's luckily a lot less of that than there used to be. I think there are a lot more big voices that are willing to challenge than there were before, but it's still an uphill battle.
So a lot of our constituency here is obviously Christians, and there's specific broadly evangelical, Protestant, and there's been a sort of decades ago an abdication of any kind of national leadership by Protestants, and we can argue that it was good for that particular aristocracy to die in most respects. But even as a strong, I just saw a clip from back in 2016 the other day of Trump even recognizing, the evangelicals are the white evangelicals are the largest voting bloc. You could do whatever you wanted if you had a consciousness in that way, a political consciousness, and took care of business. But it seems to me that evangelicals are either so demoralized or so brainwashed that they are still at this, late kind of hour non-assertive. Um, I mean, do you see any signs of life on that side of the spectrum in that particular constituency?
Somewhat. I mean, obviously, you see the surge of people under the banner of Christian nationalism. I have my own problems with the Christian nationalism, not because I disagree with any of its principles, but because I think that it's a branding trap designed by our regime, and it's very obviously going to be used to throw people in gulags. But you know, I, we could get into that if you want to, but the very fact that anyone is even showing interest in that is important. For a very long time, evangelicals were convinced that we were going to have like these neutral governing institutions, and that involving yourself in government power was actually like dirty. It was Christians didn't do this. You don't get your hands dirty like that. You let Caesar handle those kind of things. And so they kind of ended up getting exactly what we deserve. Now, in some sense, this is baked in. Obviously, the many parts of the evangelical tradition are based on the idea that actually you really shouldn't be involving yourself with a lot of governance. But I think that also just kind of rode on this idea of that there would be this cultural Christian consensus, and you could rely on that, and it didn't need to actually be baked, hardwired into any of your institutional power or your institutional memory. And that's a lesson that we're going to get to learn real hard. That was a complete failure of leadership. If you don't rule, someone else will. If your values aren't the ones being perpetuated, someone else will. Your posterity is not automatic. You do not just get to assume. And a lot of this does come on, honestly, from kind of the eschatology of the baby boomers. Like, they are the
Hmm.
last generation, and they didn't need to worry about history was over. We had reached the new millennium, and if America and Christian America fail, that was just the end of the universe. Like that could, the only way that this could end is God coming back. Literally, if you talk to most Christian boomers, evangelical Christian boomers, they cannot imagine a world where America is not like just the obvious controlled Christian superpower, and all without like Jesus returning. Like, those are the only two options. They can't imagine it any other way. And so I think that meant that they abdicated a vast amount of their duty of leadership. And we're going to have to figure this out real quick, because if we don't, then our enemies are going to figure it out for us, and it's not going to be great.
Well, since you raised it, sure, let's do Christian nationalism as well while we're on the topic. There's been others. American Reformer doesn't take a position on the label or anything, but we've certainly hosted a lot of the conversation on this. I myself am perfectly comfortable with the label, but there's been, I think, fair critiques by others as well, and somewhat along the lines that you were plugging there, of whether it's just a branding problem, whether it's a viable movement or whatever you want to call it, that will attract enough energy and participation to actually do anything, so on and so forth. So what's your assessment of that particular conversation that's going on the right now?
I'll be honest. So the problem is, like, there's multiple books. I know Stephen Wolfe has one. I know Isker and Torba had one out, and I have not read these. So I'm sure that these issues have been answered by some of these people in there. So I'm speaking without knowing their arguments. But I'll be honest, I'm buried in a pile of required reading right now, and I just have not gotten to those books yet. But my concerns are this. When you look at what I pay attention to, I think some of the reason that people listen to what I say is that I pay a lot of attention to language and the way that rhetoric is used. And it was just very, very clear, like clear as crystal, that while I know the term Christian nationalism predates our current kind of debate over it, that it was pushed really heavily before it was very popular among any Christians by the media. They took this and they started creating this boogeyman of Christian nationalism. And the reason they're doing that is very simple. It sounds like white nationalism. And they recognize that the majority of people who are going to be involved in Christian nationalism are going to be white evangelicals. And so they are trying to tie the idea of Christian nationalism to white nationalism. And they are going to use that to say that any involvement of Christianity in politics, any attempt to found our laws or our values or our standards in Christianity. Any attempt to have our institutions reflect Christian values and inculcate them into the next generation is a version of white nationalism. Now they're going to say that no matter what. I want to be really clear. And I've heard Wolf and others say this, and they're right about that. They're going to push this label no matter what. That doesn't mean you have to step directly into this trap. So my problem with Christian nationalism is it's obviously been set up by your enemies. The term was chosen by your enemy for a reason. But on top of that, I think there's a deeper problem. Christian nationalism fetishizes what was just American politics. It was just American nationalism. The American nation was always a Christian nation. It was always a Protestant Christian nation from its inception. It was baked into every aspect, from the language of the documents to the principles to the culture, the regional cultures. Everything about it was soaked in Christian nationalism. And when you use newspeak to describe something that's very old, I think you create a problem, because it makes it sound like it's some kind of cheap political rallying cry. And I'm not trying to decry the people who are doing it. I'm not saying they have bad motives or any of this. They have very good motives in general, I think. But you're cheapening what was the true foundation of the nation. You're making it sound trendy and like something that was cooked up in a think tank, when it's actually like just the deep roots of the country. And it also has the problem of not actually addressing also, thirdly, like what a nation actually is. America is a Christian nation, but it is not Christian nationalism any more than like, Ethiopia and Armenia were Christian nations way before the United States. Christianity is a part of what makes the United States, but it is not the entirety. In fact, it's necessary, but and please hear me, I'm not saying that Christ is not sufficient or Christianity is not sufficient, but Christianity itself is not sufficient to have a national identity. And so I think that, again, when people hear this, they think that like, well, then once we just get everybody Christian, then we'll have a nation. Or once we have kind of a return to some kind of Protestant Christian consensus, then we'll have a nation. And it's like, no, actually, nationalism is much more than that. And it's a lot of things that people don't want to talk about. And Christianity is kind of the safest thing to talk about. And so we'll just talk about that instead.
Yeah, I mean, when I talk to boomers, if they're at all aware, it always goes right to revivalism. That's what's going to save us, right? We need revival, everyone to make some kind of credible public profession of faith. And if that can't happen, then, nothing can work and there's nothing to do. So that's obviously to be avoided. And I think some people that do even traffic in the Christian nationalist language basically have that in mind, with a few policy prescriptions like, well, let's get trans stuff out of the schools, and then that's about it, right? So it's taken on that kind of, hokey, one-dimensional approach. But I would say I think the latter question, the second question you're raising, is important, and it's probably what actually got Stephen to got Stephen so much flack from what he wrote, because he did try to deal with the what is a nation, what's an ethnicity, these sorts of questions, which no one wants to do. And so that was eye-opening, because most of the mainstream reviews and those sorts of things were entirely negative for that very reason, because no one's ready to discuss those more fundamental things that make up a nation, even if there's some, and then you have the boogeyman of theocracy, and that's fine, they're going to do that, but no one was really ready, even on our own side, to do that, and which is depressing. The only pushback I would provide is on the branding aspect. There's a certain sense in which labels are never really chosen for any kind of insurgency or movement, and they are often given to you by your enemies. And there's, we can get all kinds of examples for that. But if it's galvanizing by its embrace, then, you haven't really chosen it. It may be effective. And you see this with things, we're talking about motivated minorities kind of rule the day. You see this totally with the gay rights movement, right? Now we can't replicate that because it's playing on many, many things we would like to destroy, such as victimhood mentality and so on and so forth. But the aspect of pride and embracing being gay and queer as labels that were previously pejorative, was actually in the relatively short order a source of strength. To say we're exactly what you think we are, and we're going to parade around and ram it down your throat. Now, the extent to which that is replicable on the right is a big question, but it at least doesn't discount the effort or the maneuver at the outset.
That's true. I would say this. The reason that that works for kind of the LGBTQ whatever movement is that it is subversive. And so they can inhabit the monster because that is what they want to be. That is what they want to become. And so they are dismantling it's an entropic movement that gets to dismantle tradition, and it gets to embrace subversion in a way the movements on the right don't get to, because we're actually involved in extropy. We're actually looking to we're looking to create something. We're looking to create unchallengeable axioms on which we can found the good and the beautiful and the true. Those pillars are critical to us in a way that they are. Now, I fully embrace, or I fully acknowledge that the horse is probably out of the barn when it comes to Christian nationalism on this one. I think that is probably just going to be the title no matter what. And so perhaps, that's just where we're at. I'm just worried, like I said, that a lot of people are going to lose the understanding of kind of what it is and what it's connected to and what it really means because of that. But you're right that at some point the friend enemy distinction is simply forged in the fact that enough people hate you collectively. And that might simply be the reason that title wins no matter what.
Well, it's like the meme I saw yesterday going around where the guy was like, I don't know if God is real, but the fact that my enemies so badly want me to think he's not means I'm just going to at least accept provisionally that he is.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So it's just that kind of thing.
Yeah. The main thing is just not inhabiting the form your enemies want you to take. That's always the danger of taking on the banner that they've handed you. And Christian nationalism is not, it's not fascism. It's not being an edgy Nazi. It's a very different thing. And so I don't think there's the same level of danger there. But I'm just saying, by by letting your enemy dictate the frame in which your movement is placing itself, you let them define the parameters on what you're going to be and the things you're going to choose and the things you're going to discuss and what's going to limit and what's going to define you. And so just being aware of that issue and that lack of ownership in certain parts of your identity formation is critical, because the media is going to shape. Most Christian nationalists are going to, let's be honest, have their understanding of the world shaped more by media than by Stephen Wolf's book. And so they're going to say, I'm a Christian nationalist, and the media told me this is what Christian nationalists are or do or say, and this is how they are defined, and so therefore I am defined that way. Always remember that your movement is going to be turned into the lowest possible resolution of whatever you created. And just be aware of that, especially if someone else gets to dictate what the majority of people think about what you're doing.
Yeah, I want to hop in and say,
well, Josh,
one other thing on Christian nationalism, and it is totally admittedly a neologism. I mean, even the word nationalism sort of meant one thing in a very particular way if you're talking about 19th century Europe, right? And then it means a very another thing in like Yoram Hazony's telling, which is sort of a more just sort of articulating the pre-modern idea of the nation to very like sort of deracinated modern people who only know how to think in terms of liberal democracy and multiculturalism. So some of that neologistic work is going on in this thing, but I would say in Stephen Wolf and some of the other most thoughtful proponents of Christian nationalism, there's sort of an esoteric thing going on, which is it's not so much a call for a majority of the populace to return, to founding conditions or something like that. It's, I think in some cases, esoterically, a call or a siren call toward ethnogenesis, toward the formation of a new type of political consciousness. that perhaps is particularly needed or called for in our current environment, where the constitutional order is sort of obviously breaking down, and everybody knows it, and we're seeing sort of increased um, factionalism, and in such a similarly at the same time, digital technology enables much more of what you might call tribal dynamics, and so sort of in this new unpredictable world, I think what the function that Christian nationalism is really playing is trying to awaken political consciousness and sort of plant a flag around which Christians can sort of gather. So it's in that sense, it's very
Mm-hmm.
future oriented, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it has. I mean, there's other adjacent, I would say, sort of people doing the same thing in that regard. That is, I would consider them totally allies. I don't need anyone to adopt the label. I'd say much of what Haywood writes about with his foundationalism has much overlap, and even people that have criticized Christian nationalism on a sort of branding level, like you did, Auron, at the beginning of this part of the conversation, like our friend and an American reformer, Aaron Renn, has spoken on this, where even though he thinks the branding is bad, then when he goes on to talk about how Christians need to operate, in his negative world, it's there is extreme overlap, and sort of, he'll talk about in a recent speech, Americans need to remove their loyalty from the quote unquote constitutional order and the government structure and the furthest reaches of the empire, and transfer their loyalty to the American people and the American way of life. And they need to work to define that again. That would be a very basic sort of move I would want, Christians to do, whether they consider themselves, they've embraced the label or not. I think that's necessary and implied in both.
Absolutely. Yeah. Like I said from the beginning, my problems are not with the prescriptions,
Yeah.
and I would largely probably agree with most of what is being suggested there. In fact, I also speak about the necessity of that in the total state. Joseph de Maistre is a thinker I pull from
Mm-hmm.
a lot, and he explained that constitutions don't make peoples, peoples make constitutions, and that
Mm-hmm.
you can't. The only reason a constitution has any value is that it's really just the instantiation of a way of being that is already present in a people. And so the Constitution, as we understand it today, can't exist. That's the Constitution didn't fail, to be clear. We asked the Constitution to do something it was never meant to do, that the founders never believed they could do. The founders told us who the Constitution was for. It was for a moral and religious people who could live under its dictates, who could and at some level have the level of virtue and local order necessary to operate under this system, and it was not made for anyone else. And so the minute we became a different people, the Constitution, it couldn't govern us
Mm-hmm.
anymore. And so what we've done is mutated over and over and over and over and over again to try to govern the people we've become. But it was never meant to do this, and now we hold it up as some kind of sacred document that was meant to forge us into who we are today. But that's exactly the opposite of the way that it should it should work. And so
Mm-hmm.
I would agree with him entirely that pledging yourself to the order of what the United States has become is insane, because the United States is now made to govern a people entirely different, and really a global empire that's entirely different from anything the founders would have envisioned. And so we I would agree with him entirely there. That's not something we can do.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a weird relationship between not just constitutions, but even, positive law that we pass. Of if something's being codified, it means it already exists almost necessarily. And then it's reinforced, right? So in that sense, culture is downstream of law. You can see this most obviously after Obergefell. But Obergefell was codifying something that was either inevitably going to happen or already basically had. And we do this. This is why it's depressing to see us, if our big debates are over trans bathrooms, you've basically already lost, because it means that it's a possibility and that it's something that's already, you're trying to stop because it's already happening. And the same is with, our most basic kind of constitutional order. If it's not reflecting something that already exists and is arising from that, but is sort of artificially imposed, you're naturally going to have tension and dysfunction. It's almost
I think
inevitable.
the interesting thing about our Constitution is just its ability to flex with very different ways in which power is descriptively actually wielded in society, right? I mean, at our founding, we purported to have dual sovereignty between states and the federal government. And then of course, through the events of the Civil War, and then especially the 20th century, like real descriptive power actually aggregated up at the federal level. And then I would say today, in times of great federal gridlock, we're seeing in these energetic state level executives the ability to have little sovereignty contestations and actually just reaccrue power for themselves. And the remarkable thing is, I think that all of that can sort of happen without like formally breaking the Constitution. So it's got a lot of flexibility and fluidity to it, even as descriptive power actually changes in very meaningful ways.
I would actually disagree with that quite vigorously.
I think
that I understand what you're saying. There's an argument there, but I would say that the United States simply doesn't recognize formally when there's been a coup. We've had at least 5 republics in the United States, but we treat it as one continuous government. We never got rid of the Articles of Confederation. We never actually went through the process of dissolving them. We simply pretended like it was okay that different people wrote up an entirely different government and passed it without any formal going through the process, the formal process of doing so. We did the same thing when it came to the Civil War. Obviously, the Civil War was the most old school assertion of whether or not you had the right to rule someone. We did this again with several different amendments. The FDR Revolution. We did this with the Civil Rights Revolution. We've fundamentally changed the way that the United States has been governed, and we just haven't acknowledged that we just haven't had a constitutional republic in a very, very, very long time. And so I don't know if that's so much to the flexibility of the Constitution as it is to the unwillingness of the American people to kind of relabel their new government.
Well, I don't disagree with any of that, Auron, but I guess what I would say is, notwithstanding all of that, appeals to constitutional legitimacy, and by which I mean, written constitutional legitimacy, still really matter in a very real political sense for a leader's sort of acclaim and legitimacy. So to the extent that, Abbott, right, he takes very aggressive action at the border, and to the extent that he has a constitutional hook, so he's got the invasion clause in the Constitution, that really matters for the acclaim of the people that he's able to accrue, which then sort of gives him the confidence to act as a sovereign in a particular case. So it's the Constitution is open enough that different factions can make sort of different claims to legitimacy when they're taking aggressive action underneath it. And I think without sort of expressly disavowing the Constitution or wanting to throw it away. And I think that's really what I'm getting at with that point.
Yeah, you're right that the fact that we have basically created, and this is why I think there's a lot of there's a lot of ability for the America to kind of ignore some of the things that's happened, is that we really have maintained a two-story state. There's a political formula that we give to the right and a political formula that we give to the left, and this is why they kind of look at each other like this weird inverse reflection whenever they actually try to dialogue, because the things that the left believe give the government political legitimacy are entirely different than the things that the right believe give the government political legitimacy. And so because of that, you're right that like there's there's still the fact that the Constitution is still in some way part of the regime's ruling formula does still give it the ability of someone like Abbott to go ahead and cite that and have a standing. So I'm not saying that the Constitution doesn't matter at all, because you're absolutely right that that's still a very relevant part of it. But I'm just saying that I think that that's more due to the way that our political formulas have split and sectioned themselves off almost entirely from each other than it is necessarily like a particular flexibility of the Constitution. But we could be in danger of nitpicking that all day. So
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's basically right. I mean, the left is they wring their hands much less over whether they have a constitutional hook, even ostensibly, to do much of what they do. They just go and do it, and that's why you see a difference of treatment between what Abbott's doing, which is like the flip side of what California's been doing with sanctuary cities for a decade now.
Mhm.
There's no challenge there, and they don't even care. And the entire posture of the Newsom government is they don't care, right? When he's questioned about, did you just clean up San Francisco for Xi? And he's like, yeah, I did. And he just moves on, and no one, really questions this. Whereas when a conservative tries to make moves, it's both imposed on them by their enemies because they know they have some kind of self-consciousness about it, and it's self-imposed, right? They want to do something that's consistent and legal and so on and so forth. And this is just one of the handicaps that we have to deal with. But on the same, in sort of the same vein, I guess this can be sort of the last question. There are many, proposals or people playing around with proposals out there that would represent sort of for a new future radical discontinuity with what we've had, or at least what we think we've had, even culturally, right? And so there may be some need for accelerationism there, so that you can pull something out of the ashes. On the other hand, I seem to think, or tend to think, that you need some historic and cultural continuity for what you're doing, at least in your appeals to it. Montesquieu will talk about any laws or any changes in policy which are necessarily violent, because that's what change is, have to suit the people, at least in their memory, their like historic memory. And so this is why appeals to the founding or to some of our history are powerful and needed and maybe actually good. Do you have any opinion on the extent of necessary continuity for change?
yeah, no, I think that is absolutely correct. Again, what I was pointing out was not that there needs to be historical continuity. That's absolutely the case. There has to
Hmm.
be continuity if you're going to create any kind of understanding of a people, any kind of way to uh, understand what the nation would be, or what the people would be. It has to be grounded in that tradition. It has to be continuous from how people understand the United States, at least at some level. That's absolutely necessary. My point in continuity was strictly like the legal
Hmm.
regime, not the
Right.
story of the people. In fact, I think the thing we've really hit on here repeatedly is the importance of separating the people from the legal regime.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's the thing that is probably the most important, because what the legal regime has become is something so desperately different from what America was, that it's unrecognizable to anyone who wants to have any historic continuity. It's impossible to square the
Yeah.
current regime with any kind of historical continuity of kind of the American identity, and that's really the thing
Right.
that I think we're trying to tackle there.
Yeah. In which case, America's inability or refusal to recognize coups when they happen, regime changes, radical reinterpretation of the constitutional order, and indeed the history. Lincoln is probably the most expert with this. Even if FDR was in some ways more effective in his coup, Lincoln's was, in terms of its rootedness, ostensibly in history, was completely radical in reinterpretation. But that it could actually be a strength or a good thing, because it means it's possible. You can project continuity, or rather than continuity, it's sort of becoming more of what we already are, is kind of the idea. We're achieving, our truer selves, is how it's always been done, and actually, can be done again potentially.
Yeah, I think that's right. Becoming what you were or what you were supposed to be is always a very compelling thing for people.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that is what the right is doing, right? With the left is deconstructing. We are not. We are finding the pillar of what we are as a people, and we're trying to stand on top of it. And that's really the critical nature of the quest for for kind of putting things together or forging something new, is to stand on what was and say, we are going to become more of that thing. And that's, to be fair, like how kind of the current civil rights regime got where they are, right? Because, well,
Mm-hmm.
really, the Constitution always meant to just give people as many rights as possible. And so by giving people as many freedoms and as many rights as possible, we're really just becoming more of what America was. But we need to be clear, like that is not actually what America was. That the America was not just the number of constitutional amendments it can create and the number of rights it can accrue to people. That it was something much different and much more and grounded in something far more powerful. And that's the story that really, I think, is the one that you need to understand and tell people.
Mm-hmm. Well, Auron, this has been great. We're coming up on time. I think we could easily go on and on. Josh, any parting thoughts, and then we'll give Auron the last word.
Thank you for joining us, Auron. Love your stuff and your work. Audience, you need to be following Auron on Twitter and listening to his show and buying his book. I think so many of the basic realities that you talk about are things that we need mass acceptance on our side in order to be effective for the future. So thank you for all your work. Thank you for joining us today.
No, thank you, man. I really appreciate it. It's been great talking to you guys.
Excellent. So the book, again, comes out on May 7th. I assume if they're not already available, pre-orders will be available soon. And we look forward to seeing the reaction and reception of that. I'm sure it'll be a lot of fun. Maybe not for you, but for the rest of us. But thanks again for joining us, and everyone, subscribe to the podcast so if you don't miss any of our episodes. Follow us on Twitter and look for our daily content on the website also. Until next time, God bless.
You can find American Reformer on the internet at www.americanreformer.org or on x.com, formerly Twitter, at @AMReformer. Don't forget to like, rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast. Please consider supporting us today by making a tax-deductible donation through our secure online donation portal at americanreformer.org. That's americanreformer.org.